thanks in particular to some of you here who we've acknowledged in the paper as helping us with this report. As Oliver says, it's been a long journey and it's been a very perplexing journey in some ways. Our first report dealt with international debt, assets, liabilities generally, and tried to dispose of a number of myths which have developed in New Zealand about living beyond our means and what we earned since 1973 sort of stuff. And I thought we'd got some traction with that, but then when I read David Parker's speech last week, I realised that we hadn't. Some of those myths were being repeated in that speech. The second report is more germane to what we're talking about tonight because it was much more specific to foreign direct investment. And the two conclusions which were most relevant to today's presentation, which came out of that, were the conclusions that we've got particular problems with international image at the very least. One is that on the OECD's restrictiveness criteria, we've got one of the most restrictive regimes in the 58 countries which the OECD assesses. So New Zealand is here, this little red line, slightly less restrictive than India, Japan, China, Weimar Republic and others of that ilk, but a lot more restrictive than Australia, which is the green line. And the United Kingdom, which after all was our mother country originally, and you'd think that we'd get most of our customs and attitudes from. It's the yellow one, it's at the more liberal end of the world. So that was one thing which came out of the report, which suggested a concern. And the other thing was the UNCTAD really does promote more than any other major international organisation the virtues of foreign direct investment and is the main statistical agency collecting them. And it has about 3 indexes of a country's potential and attractiveness for foreign direct investment. And New Zealand hasn't done well on that for many years. Back in the year 2000, for those who can't read it, New Zealand was ranked 73rd for its attractiveness as a destination source. That's out of about 300 countries plus, I think it is. But we deteriorated, and so by 2011, which is the last year for which it has data, we're down to 146. This is miles worse than Australia, which is about 50, I think, and Singapore and Hong Kong, which are the great countries for attracting FDI and have built their economic prosperity at it and have become a lot wealthier than New Zealand in terms of GDP per capita, while starting from being much poorer, have maintained sort of a top 3, top 5 ranking throughout this entire purpose. So that was sort of motivating problem, which led to this report. So this third report, Open for Business. So in this report, we've had a close look at the centrepiece of our regulatory regime, asking ourselves, well, what is it about it which is giving us such a poor international impression? And it starts at the very first section. Part 3 of the Act is the purpose statement, which tells you what it's about. And that's what it says. It says, far from thinking it's a good thing if someone like Microsoft or IKEA or McDonald's or anyone else wants to invest in New Zealand, it says that rather haughtily that they should consider themselves privileged if we allow them to invest here. So that's a very perplexing approach when you look at the legislation in other countries of the world, like Canada is explicitly welcoming it. Every country does keep an eye on different aspects of it. There are obviously potential national security issues which countries have to think about, and most countries have some industry or industries which they're particularly sensitive about, usually for national security reasons, like it's defence related or technology related to defence, but sometimes more widely than that. So we kept going through the Act, our Act, to see what it set it apart. And this is the provision which sets it apart and really gives us the bad name. It's got a prior approval screening regime, which means that anybody who wants to invest in New Zealand in something which the Act deems to be sensitive, a sensitive New Zealand asset, has to go cap in hand to the regulator and ultimately ministers to get approval. Well, how onerous. And most other countries do not have a prior approval screening regime, not of a general across all industry, across all activity nature. As I've said, they might have specific regulations in a specific industry. So, but New Zealand's scheme would still not be too prohibitive as long as sensitive assets isn't stupidly defined to include almost anything. New Zealand on the significant business assets is not all that restrictive a regime. It is across the board. It doesn't matter what the activity is, what the industry is, whether there's any national security considerations or not. It simply says if it's over 100 million, if the asset you're investing in is over 100 million and you're an overseas person and you're going to get 25% or more, you're going to be deemed to be in control of that. And we New Zealanders are very sensitive about that sort of thing. And you're going to have to notify us and get approval and that sort of thing. So that's pretty restrictive because it's pretty comprehensive. But what the Act is really sensitive about is investments in what it calls sensitive land. Now, sensitive land really is across the board sensitive almost, except not particularly for residential housing, and we differ from Australia in that respect. But we really hammer it as sensitive if it's non-urban land. Now, the best I can tell from satellite figures is that 99.2% of New Zealand's land cover would satisfy the definition of non-urban. So that's essentially all our farmland, and anything 5 acres you have to get prior approval for. Now, 84% of New Zealand farms are greater than, 5 hectares, are greater than 5 hectares. And most farms of an economic size would be greater than 5 hectares. So it would be more than 84% of farms of an economic size would be captured by that. But the definition of sensitive land also was expanded in the 2005 legislation to include land adjoining land which might be deemed to be sensitive. So that included public reserves and sort of historic heritage sites and all that sort of thing. So, and foreshore. And it was that foreshore thing which captured, an apparently innocuous proposal by a Canada Pension Board to buy shares in Auckland International Airport. That by it buying shares wasn't going to change the activity, the land use activity there. It was still going to remain an international airport. But because Auckland Airport happens to adjourn the foreshore, it was deemed to be sensitive land. And that thereby triggered the most restrictive parts of the Act. Even here, with the sensitive land, that's just a report. A very small amount of land adjoining the foreshore, 0.2 hectares, will be regarded as sensitive. But the real hard thing, which is absolutely baffling to economists like myself, is this provision that if you're going to be an absentee overseas owner of land, which means you're not intending to come and live in New Zealand indefinitely and you're not already a permanent resident or a citizen, your proposal has to pass a benefit to New Zealand test. And it's that test which is really weird. It excludes, the only real reason or the primary reason why anyone would sell an asset, because what the bar is going to give them, they think, is worth more than the benefit of holding the asset. And this was actually taken in the Crayford Farms case to the High Court. And the High Court, Miller in 2012, noticed, because the opposing counsel drew his attention to it and said, well, if you're considering the benefit to New Zealand, the New Zealand seller is obviously part of New Zealand. The benefit to the New Zealand seller must be included. And the judge ruled against it. He deemed that the Act should be interpreted as deliberately excluding the benefit to the vendor from the sale when assessing benefits to New Zealand. And as you'll see from that, well, if you can read it at the back, he said he interpreted the Act to be hostile to overseas investment, as Section 3, its purpose statement, would have suggested in anyone's minds. And therefore, by excluding that benefit, he was ensuring that an overseas investor cannot pass the benefit test merely by outbidding others. Now, when you come to our recommendations, we sort of turn it on the head and we say to ourselves, well, if you take a property right in perspective and you think about the New Zealander who's trying to sell a bit of their property, anyone selling their property on Trade Me wants the best price. You put it on Trade Me, you sell it. If someone comes along and tells you you're not allowed to take the best price because it happens to be an overseas person, you think, well, what is this? Go away, don't bother me. And in an economic sort of concept, that's how New Zealanders can hope to get wealthier by selling to the highest bidder. It gives them more money to invest in something else. If we want New Zealanders to be better integrated with the rest of the world, then we want to make it easy for them to sell an asset if they can use the proceeds to help invest overseas, to expand their operation overseas, or to set up something differently in New Zealand. So if you start with the proposition that it's a good thing if New Zealand is an attractive destination, and it's a good thing if people can sell their assets to the highest bidder if they want to, or any other bidder, if it should be free to give your own asset away if you want to, then legislation should not stop that unless there's the good public interest reason for doing so. And if there is a good public interest reason, we want to know what it is, and then the question of compensation should be addressed, because if someone's going to stop someone from doing something with their land because it's going to benefit a lot of other people, well, then it's unfair to impose the burden on that just on the person who's not getting that other benefit. So generally benefits which would be distributed across the public at large, the cost of that should be imposed on the public at large, and that's the standard compensation principle for takings of property. So that's sort of our starting question when we examine the Act, and much of this report is going into as much depth as we can as to, well, what are the problems which this Act is trying to solve? Because you can't really develop an alternative proposal or a remedy for an unidentified problem. Now, it's clear that there are problems or the Act wouldn't exist, particularly an Act in such a silly form. And one of my colleagues who's not here tonight would tell me strenuously, well, it's obvious why we have the Act. Bryce, he said, we don't like foreigners, and we're right not to like foreigners, and that's never going to change. It's part of human nature. And if silly blokes like you weren't too pure, you'd understand that, and you'd leave the Act in place and because nothing's going to change it, and we'd get on with it. But that's not a particularly good answer if you take the welfare of New Zealanders seriously. I mean, the Productivity Commission recently put out that study, OECD study, which indicated that incomes per capita in New Zealand are 20% below an OECD average, where on the basis of more easily determinable policy settings, we should be 20% higher. Well, that's a massive difference to the well-being of New Zealanders, and it makes non-materialistic things like a cleaner environment less affordable. So if there are particular problems, And the other question is, well, why would New Zealanders be so much more sensitive than the Australians or other countries, particularly the English? Are New Zealanders really sensitive about every 5 hectare bit of block outside the urban centre? I don't think they are. I suspect that they're not. I suspect that like when any of you who went student flatting, when you go flatting, you're a tenant in your own country when you leave home, but you're usually glad to get out of home and live with young people. You don't really know or care whether the overseas landlord, the landlord is an overseas person or not. Why would you care? What you care about is that the rent's a market rent, you're happy with the rent and that it's what you want. And I suspect with some of these asset sales, once the furore is over and the thing's gone, people aren't disturbed and they don't care. Treasury has been firmly of this view from the outset, to its credit, and has always said that if there's a problem with land, with what foreigners are doing with the land, it must surely be with the use they're putting the land to, not with the fact that they happen to be a foreigner. But as we all know, we have a great many statutes on the books regulating the use of land, whether it's the RMA or Historic Trust or whatever. So you start asking the question, well, what is the flaw? What are the gaps in our existing regulation of land use for which an act like this might be the solution? And that's an open-ended question. It's not one we've leapt to a judgment on. We've read as much as we could to see if anyone's written something which has identified them. And it's still an open-ended inquiry. But we've been unable to find anyone who's actually pinpointed some gaps in our existing legislation, independently of this act, of a troubling nature, let alone explained why those gaps couldn't be better filled by amending that legislation and plugging the holes. So that's a pretty weird thing, really. You get deep as you can into problem definition, and you're still coming up with the policy looking like it's more based on two things, not just xenophobia, not just dislike of foreigners, but I also think a deep-seated insecurity amongst many New Zealanders about international integration. And I always think of one of Such's early books, sort of The Quest for Security in New Zealand, that the whole cradle to grave development in New Zealand of government looking after people reflected the fact we're a small country at the far end of the world, and a lot of people didn't feel confident or self-sufficient or self-reliant. Harvey Franklin at Victoria University Geography Department published another book on trade growth and anxiety in New Zealand, and he was pushing a similar button, that there is an insecurity and a lack of confidence that does affect New Zealanders. And I think, what can you do about that if that's the problem? Well, I think it's just better debate and expressing more confidence about what New Zealanders have achieved and are capable of achieving, and the importance of integration can help, which is what this report aims to do. Now, Treasury did, I'll just come, back to that one. Treasury did a major review of the whole Overseas Investment Act in 2009 and 2010. And to the government's credit, Bill English's credit, it did that at the government's urging and acquiescence. And to Treasury's credit, I think it did a very good job in that review. It was one of the better jobs it's done in recent years. It concluded that the screening regime, as I've indicated, didn't serve a useful purpose and should have been got rid of. It produced a vast number of options, 1 dozen, 2 dozen range of options of a greater or lesser degree of radicalism for the government to consider, including changing Section 3, the purpose statement of the Act, to make it much more welcoming. But what happened in the event was that the Jolly Crayford Farms furore arose, and that completely derailed the politics of the process. It was immediately a sensitive public issue and public debate. Chinese were involved, which seems to be a particular point of sensitivity. And the government just clearly decided it was too hard and let it lapse. So they certainly made it clear, and no one, least of all me, for a moment thought that our report would change that in an election year. This is simply not the right time for any political party to be trying to make brave statements which would generate a very emotional reaction. I've covered the third point. Now there is a good question though, which is, well, how significant are these restrictions anyway? Does it really matter? The opponents of what's happening would say, well, the problem is that the OIO is just, the Overseas Investment Office, is just rubber stamping everything. It's just a farce. What should be done is not that it should be relaxed, it should be that it's properly enforced and we keep out all these foreigners who are coming in. So that's fair enough, that's the point of view, and good to have it out in public debate. Is it of substance? And it's hard to say. It's certainly true that the overwhelming majority of applications are approved. Okay, first point, true. Second point, that does neglect applications which are allowed to lapse or withdrawn, perhaps because the applicant doesn't think they're going to go ahead. And that is a much greater number of applications than the ones who are declined. The third thing is, we don't know how many applications aren't put in the first place, because a big firm thinks, well, why do I need to bother with such a little country? I'll just walk away. And there, no one will ever be able to really collect data, but Treasury has decided that there is credible anecdotal evidence, which we get from lawyers and the like who are dealing with potential applicants, that it is having some chilling effect. My own sense of it is, this is just from working on it and talking to people, it's nothing I could justify, is that when it comes to business assets and acquisitions, our regime isn't particularly restrictive unless it involves sensitive land, like the Auckland International Airport case. And if we're most interested in foreign direct investment, then the scheme probably isn't massively restrictive, and people like myself would not be justified in getting up in front of an audience like you and saying anything like, well, this is a game changer. If we really change this act, we could become another Singapore or something. Singapore's got something like 7 times the foreign direct investment per capita than New Zealand, all expressed in US dollars by UNCTAD. It's just massive ability to attract foreign direct investment. And that's because it's deliberately gone out to attract it and to persuade investors that they're going to be fairly treated. So I think it's a bad piece of legislation. We've got no reason for it. It's putting our international image into poor repute. GDP per capita is lagging. We need quality investment. We need better integration. We should change the jolly thing unless someone can really provide a good problem analysis which shows that it really is the solution to some real problem, rather than just a reflection of some combination of anxiety and xenophobia. Changing it could be a big change or a little change. An obvious change is on the business acquisition test. There's this silly thing that some applicant wanting to buy a controlling stake in a 100 million plus asset has to prove their business acumen and experience and their financial commitment. Well, gosh, if they're a foolish investor and they're paying the New Zealander a higher price than anyone else, why on earth would you want to stop them? Exactly who's the legislation trying to benefit at this point? Certainly not the New Zealand vendor. hard to see how it can stop anyone else. I mean, the US has been very happy in the days at the boom of the Japanese property market to sell all sorts of Empire State Buildings and things to Japanese investors and watch them take an enormous bloodbath when prices drop. We shouldn't try and stop overseas investors from folly, if it is folly, which I doubt in the first place. Another objection, though, is, which I'll come to, which Jane Kelsey would run hard at Auckland University, is that it's wrong to treat foreign investors equally, and it's wrong to, because we should prefer New Zealanders, and it's wrong in particular to enter foreign trade investment agreement, free trade agreements as we are, which include investment provision clauses in them, which have things like if both governments agree that if either of us expropriates sort of property rights of one of your investors in our country, then we'll address the issue of compensation. To me, there's nothing wrong with that, because you wouldn't do it unless the benefits from doing so were greater than the costs of the compensation. That's the net benefit test, in which case you're happy to do it. It doesn't make you worse off doing it. But the counter view is that it's sort of a fiscal illusion one, that if you have to pay compensation, then it really does raise the costs, and so you won't do it. And so that means that you've become beholden to the overseas investor, and you've got them, if you're more protective of property rights of the overseas investor than you are of New Zealand investors, then you've done New Zealand investors in the eye. Well, to me, the answer's obvious. You should offer the same protection to New Zealand investors, because if you don't have well-defined property rights and well-secured property rights, you can't expect to be as prosperous a country as you would be if you did do that. And I encounter all the time in public sector circles or publications what economists call the fiscal fallacy, and that is the view that if you pay compensation, it's not worth doing. In a cost-benefit analysis, as I've just tried to explain, if the benefits of stopping someone from doing something with their property for the community exceed the costs, then the community is happy to pay those costs because they still come out ahead. That's what a cost-benefit test is. So the argument that it can't be done but if you pay compensation, but it can otherwise, to that economic analysis is purely a predatory argument. It's not a cost-benefit argument. So that's the debate with the free trade agreements and the investment agreements, and that's a hot debate on its own and in its own right, but it is part of this conversation. So that's the report. We've got 10 recommendations in there in total. I've given you the flavour of them. The selling point really is to turn it on the head a bit and stop looking at what the overseas investor do and ask the question as to why should the New Zealanders' property right to sell be infringed. Once you've got a good reason for that, then you can start doing a public analysis on it. Our lesser recommendations are to just leave it in place, narrow the definition of sensitive land. We considered the question of whether we should go like Singapore and many other countries and actually put in tax preferences and other incentives and subsidies for foreign direct investment, on the argument, which we support to some degree, that there are spillover benefits of all sorts, as there are from many forms of investment. We think we've come out, opposed that on balance. We're open about the argument in a specific case, but in general, we think that that's a bit too hard, and it opens itself to too much political favouritism, not based on real assessed benefits. And we do have to watch the ability of politicians to confer benefits on particular parties on a case-by-case basis. New Zealand probably rightly does score very highly on the international anti-corruption stakes, but the more you allow politicians to provide corporate welfare in particular cases, the more you put that sort of thing at risk. So we've tended to come out against that as a general proposition. So the recommendation is no prejudice against foreign investment, but no favours either. Yeah. So it's symmetric. Another central piece, of course, is to create a presumption in favour of the proposed transaction. Transactions between a willing buyer and a willing seller should be presumed to benefit both parties. So there isn't a reason for stopping that unless you can clearly show a harm to some innocent third party or other person. So the burden of proof shouldn't be on the parties to the transaction. Yeah, so there we are. Thank you very much for your attention. That's a run through what the report does. It's not a topic for public debate that's going to be ended by this report or any other report in the foreseeable future, and it's certainly not going to be a public debate which will get a lot of rationality in until after the election's over. Thank you.